The air in the room smelled of cardboard, old pine, and the ghost of a perfume I hadn't worn in a decade. It was a hollow scent, settling in the back of my throat like a premonition. I stood in the center of the empty floor, listening to the house settle, but my ears were tuned only to the rhythm on the stairs. Heavy boots, deliberate and unhurried. That sound hadn't changed. The doorknob turned, the brass mechanism clicking loud in the silence, and suddenly, the room felt like a lung drawing in a sharp, desperate breath. She didn't just enter the room, she claimed it. The door frame, which had always seemed wide enough when we were 17 and rushing through it to escape my parents' dinner parties, now appeared dangerously narrow. She stood on the threshold, one hand resting high on the jamb, and the light from the hallway silhouetted a figure that was familiar yet entirely foreign. The space between us, usually measured in miles and missed calls, collapsed into 10 feet of dusty floorboards. Her presence was formidable, a physical weight that displaced the stagnant air and forced it into the corners. I watched her take in the room, her gaze tracking the peeling wallpaper and the faded squares where posters had once lived. She had changed. The girl I remembered was all sharp elbows and nervous energy, a creature of potential kinetic force. The woman standing there now was solid, grounded in a way that made the floor joists seem fragile. Her shoulders were broader, filling out a leather jacket that had seen more weather than this town had to offer. There was a confidence in her posture, an easy stillness that felt unsettling in a space defined by our teenage anxieties. She looked like she had conquered the world outside, while I was still trying to pack up the one inside. This room had been my sanctuary. It was where I hid from the expectations of the town, where I read books by flashlight, where I whispered secrets into the dark. But as she stepped fully inside and the door clicked shut behind her, the sanctuary dissolved. The walls seemed to press inward. It was no longer a haven. It was a cage, a small, square box containing too much history and nowhere near enough oxygen. I felt the sudden, irrational urge to open the window, but the sash had been painted shut years ago. I was trapped in the amber of my own making, and she was the only living thing in the frame. "Hey," she said. The word was simple, low, a contralto that vibrated against my ribs. "Hey," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy in comparison. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with everything we refused to say. It wasn't the comfortable silence of old friends. It was the thick, static-filled air before a summer storm. I looked at her, really looked at her, and the fear held me captive. It wasn't fear of her exactly, but fear of being seen. For 10 years, I had curated a version of myself for phone calls and holiday visits, a version that was fine, that was steady, that was content. But standing here, surrounded by the detritus of my youth, I was stripped of those defenses. She knew the girl who had lived in this room. She knew the dreams I had abandoned and the fears I had never outgrown. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to strip away the layers of adulthood I had carefully applied, leaving me exposed and raw. I shifted my weight, the floorboard creaking under my foot, a sharp sound that seemed to startle the dust motes dancing in the shaft of afternoon sun. I wanted to ask her why she had come. I wanted to tell her to leave before the pressure in the room became unbearable. I wanted to cross the distance and bury my face in the worn leather of her jacket. I did none of these things. I just stood there, clutching a roll of packing tape like a weapon, while the tension hummed between us, a tangible thing that tasted like ozone and regret. She took a step toward the center of the room, her boots making a solid, authoritative thud on the wood. The movement disrupted the tableau, breaking the paralysis but ramping up the panic. She wasn't staying by the door. She was coming into the cage with me, and the air grew thinner with every inch she closed. The room, once empty, was now dangerously full. She stopped at the bookshelf, the cheap laminate bowing slightly under the weight of dusty paperbacks and forgotten artifacts. Her attention didn't land on the books, though. It drifted to the corner, to the small collection of plastic and faux marble that I had failed to pack away. She reached out, her movements precise and economical, and picked up a track trophy from our junior year. It was a generic figure, a golden runner frozen in mid-stride, the plating flaking off to reveal the gray metal beneath. In her grip, however, it looked less like a piece of junk and more like a relic, a holy object excavated from the ruins of a civilization we had built and destroyed together. The silence in the room shifted, growing sharper. I watched her turn the trophy over in her hands, her thumb brushing away a decade of dust from the engraved plate. The sound of her skin against the textured base was a whisper that seemed to tear through the quiet. It pulled me back, violently, to the heat of that afternoon. The air in the stadium had been thick with the smell of cut grass and rubber, the sun beating down on the bleachers until the metal burned our thighs. I hadn't been running that day. I was, as always, the observer. I sat in the stands, knees pulled to my chest, watching her down on the track. She was formidable even then. I remembered the way she looked at the starting line, the absolute, terrifying focus that narrowed her world down to the lane ahead. When the gun went off, she didn't just run. She tore through the atmosphere. I used to hold my breath when she ran, a sympathetic tightening in my own chest, as if by suffocating myself, I could lend her my oxygen. I was the keeper of her water bottle, the guardian of her towel, the one who waited at the finish line to catalog her triumphs. It was an ache I had never named, a hollow space in my center that only filled when she looked up at the stands and found me. I told myself it was friendship. I told myself it was pride. But standing in this shrinking room, watching her hold the evidence of that day, I knew it was simply devotion. I focused on her hand, the one currently encompassing the trophy. It was different now. The hand of the girl I knew had been calloused from the handlebars of a bike and the strings of a guitar. But this was something else. Her skin was rougher, marked by the kind of labor that changes the structure of a person. There was a small white scar running along her thumb, and her knuckles were slightly swollen, the skin dry and weathered. It was a capable hand, a hand that knew how to fix engines, how to build structures, how to survive in a city that didn't care if she existed. The trophy became a sudden, sharp symbol of the distance between us. She had won. She had taken that kinetic energy, that refusal to be static, and she had used it to propel herself out of this town, out of this life, and away from me. I had stayed. I had kept the trophies on the shelf, dusting them occasionally, preserving the shrine to a time when our orbits were identical. She had built a life with those hands, a life I knew only through the distorted lens of social media and brief, halting phone calls. I felt a wave of jealousy, not for her success, but for the world that got to experience her competence, her strength, while I was left with the plastic echoes of who she used to be. She set the trophy down. The click of the base against the shelf was final, dismissing the memory. She didn't look at me, but I saw the muscle in her jaw feather, a sign of tension I had memorized before I knew my multiplication tables. "You kept it," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with a flatness that suggested she wasn't sure if she was flattered or unsettled. "I kept everything," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could polish them. She turned then, her back to the shelf, her profile cut sharp against the fading light of the window. The trophy was behind her, the past safely returned to its dust. Her gaze moved past me, landing heavily on the center of the room. The bed. It was a massive, solid oak structure, a remnant of my parents' belief that furniture should outlast the house itself. It dominated the space, an island of mattress and quilt that we had to dismantle. "Well," she said, the formidable set of her shoulders returning as she faced the task. "Let's get this over with." The bed sat in the center of the room, like a challenge. It was a massive thing, solid oak and stubborn, a monstrosity my father had bought at an estate sale when I was 12. He had been convinced that sturdy furniture built character, but all it had really built was a permanent obstacle in the geography of my life. It weighed a ton and occupied the space with the unyielding permanence of a mountain range. We approached it like bomb disposal technicians, wary and respectful of the potential for disaster. There was a ritual to stripping a bed that felt devastatingly domestic, a task that belonged to couples or parents, not to two friends separated by a decade of silence. I pulled the heavy quilt off the corner, the fabric heavy with the scent of lavender and stagnation. She caught the other side without a word. The fabric snapped between us, a sudden, sharp sound that made me flinch. We folded it in silence, matching corner to corner, her hands smoothing the worn cotton with a casual efficiency that made my chest ache. Then came the sheets. There is something inherently vulnerable about a bare mattress. It is not meant to be seen. Stripping away the layers felt like peeling back skin, exposing the raw, unpolished reality of the years I'd spent sleeping here alone. I watched her yank the fitted sheet loose, the elastic snapping back against the wood with a violent crack. She bundled the linens into a ball, her movements rougher than mine, less sentimental. She wasn't handling a memory. She was clearing a workspace, and her detachment felt like a judgment I couldn't quite decipher. "Mattress first," she said, her voice cutting through the swirling dust. She moved to the head of the bed, wedging herself between the oak frame and the wall. I took the foot. The mattress was an old coil spring beast, heavy and awkward, a dead weight that refused to cooperate with our intentions. "On 3, she commanded, her eyes locking onto mine. 1, 2, 3. We lifted. The strain was immediate. The mattress bowed in the middle, fighting us, trying to slide back down into the safety of its frame. I gritted my teeth, digging my fingers into the piping, feeling the metal springs groan under the pressure. But as we hoisted it up, the air in the room shifted again. The exertion forced the air from her lungs, and with it came a scent that hit me harder than the physical weight of the bedding. It wasn't the stale cardboard smell of the packing boxes anymore. It was rain. It was the metallic tang of engine oil and the rich organic smell of old leather warmed by body heat. It was the scent of the outside world, of storms and highways and things I had only watched from behind glass. It washed over me, drowning out the detergent, claiming the space as hers. We had to pivot to get it through the narrow clearance between the dresser and the door. "Watch your knuckles," she warned, her voice strained tight with effort. We shuffled sideways, a clumsy, four-legged crab of a creature. For a moment, we were perfectly synchronized. My step matched hers, my shift in grip mirroring the way she adjusted her hold. It was a physical language we hadn't spoken in years, but the vocabulary was still there, dormant in the muscle memory of our limbs. We used to move hay bales like this. We used to move fencing. The rhythm of shared labor was the one thing time hadn't eroded. But the mattress was slipping. My grip was sweating. "It's sliding," I gasped, the panic rising, not because of the furniture, but because the coordination was failing. "I've got it," she grunted. She shoved her shoulder into the bulk of the mattress, using her body as a brace. The movement was violent and sudden. It broke the polite, careful distance we had been maintaining since she walked in. This wasn't a social call anymore. It was work. The pretense of catching up evaporated under the sheer, brute physics of the task. We weren't friends reminiscing. We were two bodies straining against gravity, sweat starting to prickle at my hairline, the heat rising in the small room. "Hard left," she ordered, no please or thank you attached. I obeyed instantly. We swung the mattress around, the corner missing the dresser by a fraction of an inch, and let it drop against the far wall with a heavy, dusty thud. It stood there, a wall of fabric blocking the closet, leaving us with the skeletal remains of the oak frame. I leaned back against the dresser, breathing hard, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't just the exertion, it was the proximity. For those 30 seconds of struggle, we had been a single unit again, connected by the shared weight. Now, the connection was severed, but the energy remained, vibrating in the empty space where the bed used to be. The mattress was gone, but the frame remained, a stripped wooden skeleton that looked far more imposing now that it was bare. It was a massive structure, dark oak slats running like ribs across the center, the headboard rising up like the tombstone of my childhood. We stood on opposite sides of the empty rectangle, staring down at the bolts that held the corners together. They were old, dark with oxidation, and settled deep into the wood grain. The bed hadn't been moved in 15 years. It had settled into the floorboards, rooting itself into the foundation of the house just as deeply as I had rooted myself in this town. "We can't move it whole," she said, assessing the geometry of the door frame with a critical eye. "We have to take the headboard off. The bolts are back there." She pointed to the narrow gap between the heavy oak headboard and the plaster wall. It was a space of perhaps 18 inches, a dark canyon where dust bunnies had been breeding undisturbed for a decade. To reach the hardware, we wouldn't just have to lean over. We would have to inhabit that space. We would have to crawl into the shadows together. I grabbed the toolbox from the windowsill, the metal handle cold and slick in my sweating palm. "I'll take the left," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the empty room. "I'll take the right," she countered, moving around the foot of the bed. We stepped into the gap simultaneously. The air behind the headboard was different, stagnant, cooler, smelling of dry plaster and the ancient pine of the baseboards. It was a tight squeeze. I had to turn my body sideways, sliding my back against the wall, while she mirrored me on the other end. As we lowered ourselves to the floor, the space seemed to contract. The bed frame was an immovable wall in front of us, the house wall a solid barrier behind. We were bracketed, enclosed. I knelt on the hard floor, the dust instantly coating the knees of my jeans. She did the same, her movements fluid despite the confinement. But as she settled, shifting her weight to pull a wrench from her back pocket, the inevitable happened. The space was simply too small for two adult bodies to exist without collision. Her leg brushed against mine. It wasn't a collision. It was barely a graze, the rough denim of her jeans sliding against the denim of mine. But the contact sent a jolt through me that was sharp, electric, and terrifyingly immediate. It was a physical shock, like touching a live wire in a damp basement. My breath hitched, a small, treacherous sound that I prayed she didn't hear. The sensation lingered on my skin, a phantom pressure that felt heavier than the oak looming over us. I froze, my hand hovering over the rusted bolt, waiting for her to pull away, waiting for her to acknowledge the intrusion. She didn't move. Her leg stayed where it was, pressed lightly against mine, a line of heat running from my knee to my hip. The sanctuary of my room had betrayed me. It had become a trap, a cage of limbs and wood where there was nowhere to look but at her. I was forced to stare at the profile of her face, illuminated by the dusty light filtering over the top of the headboard. I could see the grain of her skin, the way her eyelashes caught the light, the small bead of sweat tracking down her temple. I needed a distraction. I needed to anchor myself in the physical world before the internal one swallowed me whole. I focused on the bolt. It was a hex head, stripped slightly by some previous attempt at adjustment, encrusted with a layer of rust that looked like dried blood. I fitted the wrench over it, my hands shaking just enough to make the metal rattle against the iron. "It's rusted," I muttered, the excuse falling from my lips like a prayer. "Torque it," she murmured, her voice low and vibrating in the enclosed space. She was working on her own bolt, her arm brushing mine with every turn of her wrench. I leaned into the work, channeling all my panic into the mechanics of leverage. I stared at the threads, counting the ridges, forcing my mind to think about friction and oxidation and shear strength. Anything to avoid thinking about the rhythm of her breathing, which was audible now, a steady, ragged sound that matched my own. The air in the corner grew hot, thick with the scent of her, that rain and oil smell intensified by the exertion, mixing with the dry dust to create an atmosphere that felt intoxicating and suffocating all at once. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. It wasn't empty. It was full of the sound of metal scraping on metal, of fabric shifting on floorboards, of two hearts beating too fast in a space too small. I felt the urge to speak, to crack the tension with a joke, with a memory, with anything that would push the walls back out. But my throat was closed tight. I gripped the wrench with both hands, my knuckles white, and threw my weight against the handle. I needed it to move. I needed something to give because I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that if the bolt didn't break, I would. There was a sharp, high-pitched crack, a sound like a gunshot in a library. The bolt sheared off, the metal giving way under the force of my desperation. My hand flew back, knuckles rapping against the plaster, and we both froze, the sudden violence of the sound startling us into absolute stillness. The snap of the bolt seemed to unlock more than just the frame. It broke the stasis in the corner, releasing a cloud of invisible tension that had been building since she walked through the door. With the anchor point severed, the heavy oak headboard groaned, leaning forward just enough to break the seal it had kept with the wall for a decade. We both grabbed the top rail, our hands landing inches apart on the dusty wood, and pulled. The structure fought us for a second, heavy with inertia, before sliding 6 inches away from the plaster with a sound like a heavy sigh. The movement revealed a vertical strip of wall that hadn't seen daylight since the Bush administration. The paint there was a brighter, more innocent shade of blue, untouched by the sun fading that had bleached the rest of the room. But it wasn't the paint that made my breath catch in my throat. It was what was taped there, a collage. A chaotic, overlapping mosaic of our shared history that I had hidden behind the bed when I left for college. Too sentimental to throw it away, but too ashamed to leave it out in the open. It was a time capsule of yellowed Scotch tape and faded thermal paper. There were ticket stubs from the one concert we'd driven 3 hours to see, the ink barely legible now. There were notes passed in third-period calculus, folded into complex origami shapes. And right in the center, anchored by 4 pieces of tape that had turned brittle and brown, was a photo booth strip. I froze, my hand still gripping the wood, staring at the 4 grainy black and white images. We were 16. In the first 2 frames, we were making faces, crossing our eyes and sticking out our tongues, performing the expected pantomime of teenage friendship. In the 3rd frame, I was laughing, my head thrown back, eyes squeezed shut. But she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at me. Her expression in that small, pixelated square was raw, unguarded, a look of such intense, quiet longing that it felt like an invasion of privacy just to witness it now. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the photo booth. It was the night I put it there. We had been sitting on this bed, legs tangled together, listening to a burned CD on a stereo that hummed with static. The room had been dark, lit only by the green glow of the display. I remembered the feeling of her shoulder pressing against mine, a point of contact that seemed to burn through my t-shirt. I remembered the terrifying, suffocating silence between tracks, where the only sound was the bass of my own heart hammering against my ribs. I had wanted, with a desperation that felt like dying, to turn my head, to close the 2 inches between us. But I hadn't. I had been paralyzed by the fear that I was imagining the heat coming off her, that if I moved, I would shatter the only world I knew. I wondered if this was still here, she said. Her voice was right next to my ear, low and vibrating in the small space between the bed and the wall. I hadn't realized she was leaning in. I turned my head, just slightly, and found her staring at the collage, her eyes tracing the edges of the photo strip. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the girl she used to be. She let out a laugh, a short, rough sound that wasn't quite amusement. It was darker than that. It scraped against the silence of the room. God, she murmured, reaching out to touch the wall. Her finger, calloused and scarred, traced the line of the ticket stub before resting on the photo. You were so nervous that night. My stomach dropped. What? The night we took this, she said, finally turning her gaze to me. Her eyes were heavy, hooded in the dim light. "And the night you put it up. I watched you tape it there. You were shaking." "I was cold," I lied, the automatic defense of my teenage self springing to my lips. "You weren't cold," she corrected softly. She shifted her weight, and the space between us seemed to contract even further. "You were terrified. You were terrified because you wanted to kiss me, and you didn't know if I would let you." The air left the room. The confession hung there, suspended in the dust motes. She said it so simply, as if she were commenting on the weather, but the words dismantled the entire foundation of my history. I had spent 10 years believing my secret was safe, that my longing had been invisible, a private burden I carried alone. I started, but the denial died in my throat. "I was shaking too," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "I kept waiting for you to move. I held my breath for 3 hours, just waiting for you to turn your head." The walls I had constructed, the safe narrative of best friends, the carefully edited memories, began to crumble. The safety of the past was an illusion. We hadn't been two oblivious kids. We had been two people standing on the edge of a cliff, both waiting for the other to jump. The realization was dizzying. The room, the bed, the dust, it all felt different now. The nostalgia was gone, replaced by a sharp, stinging clarity. She pulled her hand back from the wall, the movement slow and deliberate. When she looked at me again, the softness was gone from her expression. The old friend catching up was gone. In her place was something else, something intense, focused, and undeniably present. The dynamic shifted in the span of a heartbeat. We weren't partners in a chore anymore. The air crackled with a new energy, something predatory and ancient. She wasn't just remembering the past. She was looking at me like she was done waiting for me to turn my head. "We should finish this," she said. But she didn't move away. She held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, a challenge issuing from the dark of her eyes. "Before the sun goes down." We turned back to the work, but the rhythm had changed. Before, the labor had been a distraction, a way to channel nervous energy into something productive. Now, it felt like a necessity, a physical imperative to burn off the adrenaline that the conversation behind the headboard had dumped into my bloodstream. The room, once a sanctuary of cool shadows, had begun to turn on us. The late afternoon sun was cutting a severe horizontal angle through the window, turning the floating dust into a haze of suspended gold, and heating the stagnant air until it felt thick enough to chew. The atmosphere was oppressive, a pressure cooker of our own making, and the walls seemed to be inching closer with every passing minute. We dismantled the side rails first. They were heavy slabs of oak, awkward in their length and unforgiving in their density. The work required a brute force that stripped away any remaining pretense of social grace. There was no room for politeness when you were wrestling 60 pounds of hardwood through a narrow doorframe. I watched her as she maneuvered the far end of the left rail, her movements sharp and decisive. The heat had forced her to shed the leather jacket, tossing it carelessly onto a pile of boxes, and now she worked in a charcoal t-shirt that was rapidly dampening with sweat. The fabric clung to her, mapping the landscape of her exertion. I found my gaze snagging on the details, the way the cotton pulled tight across her shoulders when she lifted, the tension in her forearms as she gripped the wood, the dark dampness gathering at her spine. She was a study in kinetic competence, a machine built for leverage and endurance. It was maddening. My own body was screaming with the effort, my muscles trembling with a fatigue that felt bone deep. But the exhaustion was inextricably tangled with a profound, undeniable magnetism. The ache in my arms mirrored the ache in my chest, a dull, throbbing want that grew sharper with every grunt of effort, with every bead of sweat that tracked down my temple. We fell into a silent, synchronized cadence, a dance born of necessity. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The years of separation vanished under the demands of the task, replaced by an instinctive understanding of weight and balance. I knew when she was going to pivot before she moved her foot. She knew when my grip was slipping before I could ask for a pause. We moved in tandem, a two-headed creature navigating the treacherous geography of the shrinking room. It was intimate in a way that conversation never could be. It was a partnership of sweat and strain, a raw, wordless negotiation of space. But the space was too small, and the work was too heavy. Every movement brought us into collision. We were constantly navigating the narrow clearance between the remaining furniture and the walls, forcing us to slide past one another, to reach over and around. A hand brushing against a wrist while reaching for a tool wasn't just contact, it was a brand. Her hip checking mine to stabilize a swaying board sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the impact, and everything to do with the heat of her body pressing against mine. Each touch was accidental, incidental, yet it burned with the intensity of a deliberate caress. The air in the room grew heavier, the pathetic fallacy of the weather outside mirroring the internal storm. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt expectant, waiting for the lightning to strike. We were down to the headboard now, the monolith. It was the heaviest piece, a solid wall of carved oak that looked impossible to move. We stood on either side of it, breathing hard, the sound of our respiration loud and ragged in the quiet house. My hair was plastered to my neck. Her face was flushed, a sheen of sweat highlighting the sharp line of her jaw. "Ready?" she asked, her voice rough, stripped of its earlier smooth confidence. "Ready," I lied. We gripped the top corners. The wood was slick with dust and age. We lifted. The weight was staggering, a crushing force that threatened to drive us into the floor. We shuffled sideways, inch by agonizing inch, toward the door. My fingers were cramping, my grip failing against the smooth varnish. I tried to adjust, to find a better purchase, but the sweat on my palms betrayed me. The heavy oak slipped from my right hand, the corner plunging downward with terrifying speed, dragging me off balance and forcing a sudden, desperate scramble to catch it before it shattered the floorboards. The slip happened in a fraction of a second, but my memory recorded it in agonizing slow motion. The heavy oak rail betrayed my sweating palms, sliding downward with a sickening lurch that threatened to crush my toes. I gasped, a sharp intake of dusty air, and scrambled to regain purchase, but gravity had already won the initial skirmish. I was falling backward, the weight dragging me down, until a blur of movement cut across my vision. She moved with the terrifying speed of instinct, throwing her entire body into the gap between the furniture and disaster. Her shoulder slammed into the oak, driving it into the doorframe and pinning me in the narrow space between the wood and the wall. It was a violent, clumsy collision, a tangle of limbs and panic that ended as abruptly as it began, leaving us frozen in a desperate, makeshift clinch. The crash never came. Instead, there was a sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. We were locked together, her body pressing the headboard against me, my hands trapped between the wood and her chest. The physical strain was immense. Her forearm was a rigid bar of tension against my collarbone, and I could feel the tremor in her muscles as she fought to keep the furniture upright. But the weight of the oak was nothing compared to the weight of her proximity. The intimacy distance I had tried to maintain, that safe, polite buffer of 3 feet, had collapsed to zero. Time seemed to suspend itself in the dust-choked air. The house around us fell dead silent, as if holding its breath to watch. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a rhythmic, thudding roar that drowned out the distant noise of traffic. I could smell her, really smell her, not just the overlay of engine oil and rain now, but the underlying scent of warm skin and salt, a smell so familiar and so devastatingly specific that it made my head spin. It was the scent of the girl who used to share my headphones, matured into the woman who was currently holding me up. I looked up. I had no choice. My head was tipped back against the doorframe, and she was looming over me, filling my entire field of vision. Her face was inches from mine. I stared into eyes that were usually so guarded, so careful to reveal nothing, and found them terrifyingly open. The pupils were blown wide, dark pools that reflected the panic and the heat of the moment. There was no mask there, no old friend pleasantries, just a raw, unadulterated intensity that stripped me bare. The fear that had always governed our relationship, the fear of crossing a line, of ruining the friendship, flared hot and bright. It held me captive, pinning me to the wall more effectively than the furniture ever could. But beneath the fear was a realization that hit me with the force of a revelation. I didn't want to escape. I didn't want to push the bed back. I wanted this. I had always wanted this. The sanctuary of my room had never been about safety. It had been a waiting room, and I had been waiting for exactly this collision. She didn't pull away. The headboard was stabilized. The danger had passed. Logic dictated that she step back, that we laugh off the clumsiness and reset. But she held the weight, and she held the gaze, for a second too long. It was a deliberate pause, a hesitation that vibrated with intent. She was breathing hard, her breath ghosting across my lips, hot and erratic. She was testing the tension, feeling the charged air between us, waiting to see if I would flinch. "Got it?" she whispered, the words rough, scraping against the silence. "Got it," I breathed. We lowered the piece safely, sliding it the final few inches to the floor. The physical burden was gone. But as we straightened up, neither of us moved back to a safe distance. We stood there in the twilight, the air between us shimmering, the collapse of the walls fully begun. The room was finally empty. With the bed frame banished to the hallway, the space felt vast and cavernous, a stark white box that echoed with the ghost of our exertion. We were the only things left in the center of it, two vertical lines in a landscape of horizontal emptiness. The dust we had kicked up hung in the air like a golden fog, catching the last dregs of the sunset that bled through the window. It was quiet, but not peaceful. The silence was a ringing thing, vibrating with the energy of what had just happened, of the near miss and the lingering heat of her breath on my face. I leaned back against the windowsill, my legs trembling with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. The physical labor had done its job. It had burned away the nervous energy, but it had taken my defenses with it. I was too tired to lie. I was too drained to construct the careful, polite sentences that had defined our relationship for the last decade. My composure, usually a fortress built of small talk and evasive maneuvers, was nothing but rubble at my feet. I looked at her, and I didn't see the successful woman who had left town to conquer the world. I saw the girl who used to sit on my roof and watch for shooting stars. Only now, she was looking at me with an intensity that made my knees weak. She lifted a hand, dragging the back of her wrist across her forehead to wipe away the sweat. The movement was unthinking, a casual gesture of exhaustion, but it hit me with the force of a revelation. It was devastatingly intimate. It was the kind of thing you do when you are alone, or when you are with someone who knows the map of your body as well as their own. Her hair was sticking to her temples, damp and dark, and her chest was rising and falling in a rhythm that matched mine perfectly. She looked human. She looked breakable. The formidable armor she had worn when she walked in, the leather jacket, the confident stride, the easy arrogance, had melted away in the heat of the room, leaving her exposed. "So," she whispered. The word barely disturbed the air. In the emptiness of the room, her voice didn't need to project. It carried straight to me, wrapping around my ribs. "That's everything." "Yeah," I replied, my voice equally hushed, scraping against the dry air. "Everything." We weren't talking about the furniture. The subtext was screaming, drowning out the literal meaning of the words. We were talking about the history we had just dismantled, the barriers we had physically removed from the room. The bed was gone. The trophies were boxed. The past was packed away, leaving us standing in the raw, unvarnished present. She didn't move toward the door. She didn't check her watch or make a joke about needing a shower. She just stood there, leaning slightly against the wall where the headboard used to be, her arms crossed over her chest, not defensively, but as if she were trying to hold herself together. She looked vulnerable. It was a look I hadn't seen on her face since the night before she left for the city, 10 years ago. She was waiting. She was waiting for a sign, for permission, for me to either open the door or lock it. I looked around the room, at the peeling wallpaper and the scuffed floorboards. For years, I had thought of this place as a cage. I thought the town was the cage, that the expectations of my parents were the bars. But standing there in the twilight, with the dust settling around us, I realized I had been wrong. The room wasn't the cage. The silence was. The silence we had carefully constructed and maintained, the things we had swallowed and buried, that was the prison. And we had just spent the last 2 hours tearing it down, bolt by rusted bolt. The realization washed over me, cool and clarifying. I wasn't trapped. I never had been. I had just been waiting for her to come back and help me find the door. She pushed off the wall. The sound of her boot scuffing the floor was loud in the quiet. She didn't turn away. She took a step forward, closing the final, dangerous gap between us. She took that step, and the distance between us, measured in years, in miles, in the silence of missed calls, evaporated. It wasn't a rush. It was a gravitational correction, inevitable and terrifyingly slow. She reached out, her hand traversing the dusty twilight that separated our bodies. It was the hand of the friend who had bandaged my knees on this very floor, the hand of the stranger who had built a life without me, and now, simply, the hand of the woman standing in the ruins of my childhood. When her fingers brushed the line of my jaw, the sensation was absolute. It wasn't a spark, it was a grounding wire. Her skin was rough, calloused from the labor of her life, warm and damp and terrifyingly real. I stopped breathing. I stopped thinking. I simply felt. The touch was a question, tentative and raw, asking if the history we had just excavated was actually real. I leaned into her palm. It was an instinctive surrender, a crumbling of the final wall I had built to keep myself safe. My eyes fluttered shut, cutting off the sight of the empty room, leaving only the tactile reality of her. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since high school, a shaky, ragged exhale that sounded like a sob in the quiet house. "I'm here," she whispered. Her voice was a rough caress, devoid of any artifice. "I know," I managed to choke out, the words scraping my throat. She moved closer then, invading my space until there was no space left to invade. Her other arm wound around my waist, pulling me flush against her. The contact was shocking in its solidity, the dampness of her shirt, the heat of her body, the rapid thud of her heart against my ribs. It was overwhelming. The scent of her, rain, oil, sweat, and that underlying note of her filled my lungs, drowning out the dust. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and hot and smelled of exertion, and it was the most perfect thing I had ever known. She rested her forehead against mine. The pressure was a release valve. The tension that had been holding my spine straight, the fear that had kept my jaw clenched, it all just poured out of me. It was a coming home, not to a place, but to a feeling. It was the ache of a phantom limb finally being restored. The sanctuary I had tried to build with books and music and solitude was nothing compared to the sanctuary of her breath mingling with mine. When she kissed me, it wasn't with the desperation of the past or the hunger of the moment. It was slow. It was a confirmation. It tasted of salt and dust and a promise kept. It was the breaking of the silence, the final word in a conversation that had lasted a decade. I gripped her shoulders, my fingers digging into the damp cotton of her shirt, anchoring myself to this new reality. The room around us, the cage of my childhood, dissolved into the shadows. It was just a box now, a blank slate. We had cleared it out, not just of furniture, but of the ghosts that had haunted the corners. We pulled back, just an inch, enough to breathe, but not enough to be separate. The twilight had turned the room a deep, bruised purple. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable peace. "We have a lot to move," she murmured, a smile audible in her voice. I laughed, a wet, broken sound that felt like freedom. "We have time." And we did. The sun had set on the past. We were standing in the dark, together, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The room lay in shadow, stripped to its bones. But the isolation was gone. The heavy lifting hadn't been the oak frame or the mattress. It had been the truth we'd both been too afraid to carry alone. If you've ever found your sanctuary in the person who knew you before you knew yourself, subscribe for the next chapter. We're just getting started.